and sort of maybe talk to us about when you became sort of aware of role-playing or gaming as a legitimate source of academic discourse.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm Jose Zagal, he, him. I am an associate professor at the University of Utah, where I work with the Entertainment, Arts, and Engineering program, which is a fancy way of saying we're the game program on campus. A lot of students are interested in just doing video game stuff and getting into the game industry. I've been involved in games research since the end of the millennium. I just like quickly date myself there. I mean, I've been teaching game design since 2000. That's the first time I ever taught a game design class. I guess I got into games research out of a sense of, like, why is this not a thing, and I'm just going to do it anyways. Unfortunately, I had very supportive professors. My master's thesis professor was sort of, okay, sure, you go. I have a PhD in computer science. My undergraduate degrees are in civil industrial engineering, and a master's in engineering sciences, which sounds really, really technical, but I was always kind of doing game stuff on the side. If it was not on the side, it was my main thing, but also I was always able to sort of figure a way to present it such that, a respectable journal would take it, even if it took a couple of tries.
My name is Gabriel de Los Angeles, son of Chief Andy de Los Angeles of the Snoqualmie Nation. I'm a PhD over at the University of Washington and focused in learning science and human development and education psychology. A lot of my work is involved in play and learning across the life course, so I study the way that humans and even non-humans learn through play even after the age of 18, which unfortunately a lot of the play research tends to focus on K through 12. How I ended up in acknowledging that role-play research was something academic that I could do with the rest of my life was at some point at the second year of my PhD when I shifted over to doing a PhD from an EDD. And the practical difference of that is like doing practical work or theoretical research. And so I guess really it hit me when I read Gary Fine's role-playing research, and then, but really, like let's decolonize play and research a little bit. We've been talking about, so my background, my BA is in English literature, so we've been talking about narrative and thematic analysis of video games for a long time. The use of various things and themes in the Final Fantasy series, how the differences in time streams and in The Legend of Zelda across multiple game platforms, those kinds of things that geeks like to sit around and talk about. Those are entirely academic. So, yeah. And this is my child, Muriel, and they'll be with me a lot, running around. Don't hesitate to say hi, or if they say up, pick them up.
Okay, so I am Kathaleen Castillo-Jones, and I am a very recent, as in like last week, PhD in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So my research background is primarily in sociology, and my dissertation has nothing at all to do with games, but is very much qualitative research. And I am a sociologist, so I had read Gary Allen Fine, who did sort of ethnographic work on role-playing, particularly Dungeons and Dragons. And so I knew that, like, you could research games. But the way that Gary Allen Fine is portrayed in sociology is like, oh, Gary Allen Fine, he likes to study these, like, weird little subcultures, and, like, isn't it quaint that he studies, like, role-playing games? So I think for me, it took a long time to sort of break through that mindset. And one of the things that really did it was I was attending Festival, I think it was around 2010. And I had just played this really intense LARP. And Markus Montila, who is a game studies researcher out of Finland, asked if he could interview me because he was writing a paper about this game and intense experiences with role-playing. And I think that was really the moment where I was like, oh, wow, like, this isn't just like a weird thing that this person is studying. This is like they are considering this a serious academic subject, and they're doing, what I considered serious academic research about it. And I think that was really the moment where I was like, huh. And when I was sent the paper to read, I'm really seeing it come together in this way that was really impressive for me. Because it was somebody studying it not as sort of like, here's this weird stuff that these people over there do, but here's something that I do that I'm studying academically and bringing research to bear on these topics. So I think for me, that was really when it started to switch over from like, here's my weird hobby that maybe I could research to, this is a serious academic topic.
So, since each of you are doing research in this field, you have had, obviously, opportunity to delve into the other research that's out there, however much it may be. So, what would you guys say are sort of the seminal texts, the ones that you should read if you want to get started doing serious gaming research?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think before that, there's a challenge in role-playing games research, which is that it touches on lots of different areas. So it really depends on what area you're coming from, what those seminal texts might be, right? So if you're an economist and you're interested in role-playing games and understanding fan labor and the culture of sort of volunteer work, there will be a whole bunch of economic texts that you would be interested in or you would have to read. I do not know what those are, but that would be the thing to keep in mind, that role-playing games research sort of sits at this sort of intersection of multiple disciplines. We can think of it as interdiscipline or transdiscipline in many ways. For a lot of people who are mainly in it just for the role-playing games, and they're sort of like, well, I guess I have to be in this other area because that's where I can get a degree that is legitimate or whatever. There's a lot of different texts that cover not just role-playing stuff, but also play in general. I would say that for play, Johann Huizinga's Homo Ludens is sort of considered a seminal text, which sort of examines the nature of play and the role that play plays in culture and society. If you have an interest in game design and sort of thinking about games in a more formal, structured sense, K.B. Salen and Eric Zimmerman's Rules of Play by MIT Press is also seen as an important book with lots of great pointers to other kinds of research as well. I think Gabriel Fine has brought up a lot in the context of tabletop, in the context of MMOs. Oh, there's so many.
The player categorization, who's that? That was Lee?
Nick Yee.
Yee, yes.
Yeah, there's Nick Yee. Mark Chen also has a really good book.
I like Mark. I like working with him.
And Shameless Self-Promotion, which I'm guessing that's where that question was.
Yes, it was.
I've just finished working with a huge army of collaborators on a book called Role-Playing Game Studies, the transmedia approach, and I don't remember the rest of it, but Role-Playing Game Studies was the important part for myself and my co-editor Sebastian Dieterding, on a book that basically is trying to gather together all the work that is out there in role-playing games, including from different disciplines, and sort of serve as a foundation. If you like the book, maybe in 10 years or 20 years or 5 years or who knows, it will be like, oh yeah, that was an important book. That was our desire with putting that project together. I'll be talking about it in the same room, I think, after lunch as well.
Oh, what publisher?
Routledge.
All right.
Yeah, so if you're interested, feel free to contact me. I can give you there's like a code for you to get a discount and stuff like that. And a shameless.
Well, it says right here, my next question, ask Jose to talk about role-playing studies. So
seminal works in their fields, right? So you're right, it is really depending on where you're coming from. I'm coming from an education psychology background. A lot of the stuff that I've taken a look at is really piecemeal, with the exception of Brian Sutton-Smith's Ambiguity of Play. Really important book for at least designating what we talk about in terms of ed psychology for play in general, because role play isn't really it's an act, not a phenomenon of study, unless you're only talking about young kids and imaginative play.
Is it Piaget, Vygotsky?
Yeah, I'm mostly a neo-Vygotsky myself, so, and the difference between Piaget and Vygotsky, even their contemporaries, is really minimal. Just depends on whether or not you like to agree with state development or not. I'm a big fan of the continuum of thinking and speech, and it's all a bunch of academic hoodoo. But there's a piece that I absolutely fucking love called "Play as Self-Realization." That's a big tie to my work, because it does a really fantastic job of reviewing play lit down to a couple of pages in a really deliciously easy to eat way, and goes into a lot of the work I like to think about in terms of play through frames and play through what was the word? Assemblages, and the idea that these are activity systems that are all interrelationally thought through, rather than a lot of the research that I find that picks and prods at individual parts of the systems around play and LARP. And I just want more of that communal analysis and cultural, actually a lot of cultural work too. I have a lot of cultural pieces that are playing into how I think about play, as it were, as an Indigenous scholar specifically, because looking at these things through relational epistemologies, and it's just stuff that hasn't been written yet. You can give me another year so I can put my time down and write later.
So I think for me, Goffman is someone who gets cited a lot in sort of particularly role-playing studies in terms of sort of performance and presentation of self. And Goffman was a very prolific writer. So if you're gonna take the plunge, I would suggest you take that plunge. And there are, several books focused specifically on presentation of self and performance that I think are really worth delving into. Gary Allen Fine is really useful, I think, both in sort of contextualizing how to explain to people what role-playing is, for an outside audience, and I think also for sort of like ways to set up research around role-playing. My critique of the way that a lot of people use Goffman is that presenting Goffman as he's studying role-playing, whereas Goffman is studying a very particular contextual moment in role-playing, right? Studying particular games at a particular time in particular locations with particular participants. And Goffman talks a lot about this actually in the study.
Do you mean Fine?
Oh, Fine, yes. Fine talks a lot about this in the actual book, but when I see Fine being cited, it's often just the sort of general takeaway points as opposed to really situating that context of like, this was role-playing in sort of the 1980s, right? So it's a little dated, but worth the read as long as you sort of contextualize it in that way.
Kind of like multiple intelligences, just people like to pick apart.
Yes.
So much.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that's exciting is that role-playing games as a form of sort of popular culture haven't been around that long, and the research comes afterwards. And so we're sort of at a point where there's a lot of texts out there that, Sarah's book and Dave Simpkins has a book on LARP, that these might be the seminal books so that we will look back to in the future, and everyone in this room can say, yeah, I read it before it was popular, before it was popular. For some of these, actually, Sarah's book is already pretty popular, so maybe that's already done, I think. But there's we're in an interesting moment in time where we have a lot of scholarly interest and a lot of interest from, I would say, the non-academic audiences as well. So there's lots of people writing books about their experiences playing D&D growing up as a kid or participating in LARPs as a kid. So we have a lot of sort of retrospective and semi-nostalgic histories that are also looking back at the early years of the hobby as well.
Well, then at that point, shouldn't we take a look at like Nordic LARP and analog game studies as part of the cutting edge move towards the new seminal open media, open access media spaces for people to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Because we're just kind of the hipsters of role-play research.
Yeah, pretty much. There's a journal called the International Journal of Role-Playing Games, which is available online for free, and that has a lot of really interesting articles by people who were sort of at the forefront of studying LARP, especially.
Yeah, and analog game studies is sort of I would say, a mix of academic and popular writings on games. So some people that are doing sort of larger works will do a smaller, more accessible piece for a non-academic audience, and then you get people writing on lots of different things in terms of documentation and that kind of thing. So that's also available online and definitely worth checking out.
One of the things that you said that I was actually going to ask later, but it seems to dovetail really nicely, is I wanted to talk about sort of the mainstreaming of things like Nordic LARPs and these big blockbuster LARPs and so forth that are starting to come into America in a major way. And do you see that as possibly mainstreaming this enough that it's going to affect sort of the academic world as well? Do you think it will become a more common area of study?
Ooh, that's a tricky one.
I can't say yes, because that'd be I have a huge history and background in convention culture and fandom. Like, it would be like saying that the largest furry convention over in Philadelphia, 3,000 attendees, is a mark for a reason for inserting more furry fiction I mean, but then, you know, when you take a look at shows like Supernatural and a bunch of other things that do have now LARP shows, LARP episodes that do start to impact the mainstream more and more, and people like us go, hey, did you watch the LARP episodes? And, you know, and then everybody's all happy about it.
So I think for me, there's sort of two issues. One is that I feel like still, when I tell people that I study games, the assumption is that I'm talking about video games. And I feel that is a continual barrier in terms of like explaining your research or even the hobby to people outside. The other thing, and this is, I think, perhaps another disciplinary issue, is that the discipline that I'm in, sociology, has a lot of gatekeeping around what is legitimate and not, right? And so the fact that thousands of people engage in a hobby is not enough yet to make it seem like a legitimate field of study. And so I think it makes it easier to explain to people what LARP is, because like you said, I can point to these episodes or movies or documentaries, but I feel like I still do a lot of work explaining the hobby, and so that tends to like take up the attention. That's like, oh, you're studying this strange thing, rather than like focusing on it as legitimate, interesting research in its own right, and sort of those kinds of contributions I feel like get lost in the like uniqueness of the hobby, shall we say.
I mean, my department still argues about qualitative versus quantitative research. A lot of the stuff that I've been involved in still gets to that marked as exempt from IRBs, because it's not research. You're talking about looking at videos and marking down little things and coding particular sections of 30 seconds off of multiple cameras. Oh, that's not research at all. But for some reason, and it's not just for some reason either. I mean, if you take a look at NEA, NSF, and NIH, well, if you're not doing the quantitative work, you're not getting the quantitative funding.
Well, I guess in the bigger picture, how much do you really want to know about politics? And I can give you sort of a brief, really high-level picture. First of all, we are in a current, let's call it a socio-historical, cultural moment that is challenging for a lot of academic disciplines. There's a lot of emphasis on science and on technology, And that often comes at the cost for efforts in humanities and the arts and so on. So that makes research in LARP to be precarious at best. So NSF is rarely going to fund something that's LARP related unless there's a significant either technological component or scientific component attached to it, which I'm not saying is impossible, but just makes it trickier. So I just want to study this community of players to talk about what they're doing is not going to get you any research grants out of the NSF. And NIH might not even be around next year. Like, that's the moment we're living in. I think in the bigger context, if you look at games as well, so games as an area of study only really became, like a flag was planted at the ground. That was in the late 90s. Anything that happened before that was sort of piecemeal here and there. And so it has taken about almost 20 years to get to a point where people are kind of comfortable with saying games research writ large is the thing that is valid. And the current moment where academia sits right now is in a transition where the tension is whether a game should be its own thing by itself, which is what a lot of people are sort of pushing for initially, considering games as its own discipline or as its own field, or whether games will now just be a valid thing that is studied in all these other places. So for some people that means, okay, are we going to chop games up and then send them back into their own places? So you could be at an ed school and say, well, yeah, we have a whole bunch of faculty who are looking at educational games and games for education and so on, and that is now part of education. You could be in computer science and more specifically in, let's say, computer communication and say, yeah, we look at games and we're looking at why people are engaged and how to measure engagement, and that's what games means in this area. We could look at, and so on and so forth, where people that were coming together from other places to talk about games might now be coming sort of isolated again, and they sort of go back to their own disciplines, as it were. Mm-hmm. So that's a transition which is happening now as I speak, right, and might be resolved in 5 years or 10 years. We'll see how that happens. So where does LARP fit in all that? Well, LARP is like the small, ugly cousin of games. And I say that not because that's what it deserves to be or what it really is, but that's how it is seen. It's a sort of, it's a fringe within a fringe already.
Yeah.
I mean, with the focus on science and technology, the STEM, I've heard about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The big push on that, both in foundations and education all across the board, the next generation science standards and things like that. The insertion of the A in there is particularly important. There's an A in there that we can put in there that gets us back to role playing with and interdisciplinariness to make STEM STEAM, and that's a lot of the work that I get to be engaged in right now. At the governmental level, they're talking about games of whether or not games are supposed to be art pieces or whether or not they're supposed to be something else entirely. And once they're coded as art, interactive movies, or whatever, the legal definitions start to shift enough in ways that prevent us more from getting the monies for it, or maybe open up.
Well, I think that's the challenge, right? Because we kind of want them to be everything.
Right.
So we want to be able to say,
Yes.
hey, you're in med school, and in med school you did this exercises in class where you were like a doctor and someone was a patient, and you were giving them bad news about the cancer. Like, we want to call that like a mini LARP or an edu-LARP. So we don't want to sort of take that out of medicine and sort of, no, sorry, you can't do that anymore because that's like a LARP thing, and we're the LARP people, and this is what we do. So we sort of want to be in there, but we also, I mean, that's the tension, right? Like, we want to be there, but also, like, hey, we're also our own thing as well, right?
And being able to have those discussions, like you said, I mean, if everybody's in their own discipline, having to explain to the people in their discipline, like, why this is important, or, this is what a LARP is, it can be very useful to be able to have somewhere to come back to, where everybody has a common language in terms of game studies or LARP studies that they're able to talk to each other about. So my disciplinary background, in addition to sociology, is also in women and gender studies. And to me, there's a lot of similarities there, right? That most people that do work in women and gender studies aren't necessarily in a gender studies department, but having that department in a school that people can come back to, that you can have those interdisciplinary discussions that are focused around this larger subfield are really, really useful. And I feel like that's, that would sort of be the ideal for me for game studies as well.
Sort of trends right now in higher education is, in the 90s, we broke into all of these smaller departments and smaller disciplines and more specific, and now possibly because of the political climate, possibly because of money. All of those things are undoing, and you're seeing all of these little things being put back into larger, broader departments, where it's a more generalized thing instead of, like even most women in gender studies departments I know are closing down and sort of incorporating into sociology and English and, health studies and that sort of thing. So that could be a challenge, but it could also be a way of, again, sort of bringing that into main academic culture. What do you think are the other big challenges you guys have run into in the course of doing your own research?
Race and culture. I mean, that's just, for me, that's just the standard barrier that I'm going to keep running into for the rest of my life is always going to be race and culture. Ain't nobody wants me ground and going into a lot of this work, so the easy dismissal of the kind of stuff that I like to do, sort of getting pointed out as, oh, you're that dark researcher with the College of Education one. And so like, it's beyond the appearance of the things that I do that only get focused down to work with Indigenous peoples for myself and the people that who work, and the productivity of the research that I want to do to be activist enough to protect and give space to my people and other tribes around my area. That's the hardest barrier that I'm always looking for.
So I guess for me, it is related to a lot of the stuff that we've already been talking about, which is sort of money and time, having neither of those things. Because the pressure to produce these legitimate academic studies that are going to get me published in kind of journals that are going to help me to get a job or get tenure, mean that I'm always sort of doing game stuff as a side note, right? And there aren't a lot of grants for the kind of qualitative research that I do anyway, but there are even less when it comes to LARP scholarship. And so it's, sort of in my small amounts of free time and with, whatever extra money I have, that's what I have to do the research. And the kind of research that I would really like to do is these sort of like ethnographic studies and interviews and content analysis that take a lot of time to do, but also that, cost a lot in terms of travel and in terms of, going to interview people and taking that kind of time and money. So yeah, I feel like for me, it's always been this sort of like side piece, and so it always gets less attention and less time because it's not the thing that's sort of seen as advancing my career in the same way that other research will.
So I've been really lucky. I've always been able to sort of find my way into what I wanted to do anyways. And when it hasn't worked out, it's in the end worked out. Like, I thought I was chasing this and then that didn't work, but actually that was a bad idea. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of people face is finding the right community. So the way I see research is about joining a community that is interested in having conversations about a certain set of problems or questions, and everyone shares those same problems and questions. They share an interest in examining those or exploring those, and whatever they may be. And I think that's the hardest thing I see, especially a lot of students wrestling with is, I'm really passionate about X, but how do I find the community, the group of people that are also passionate about X in ways that are similar to what I am? And that's where you see often a lot of mismatch. You end up going to the education conference where everyone there is interested in, X. And you're like, well, I'm interested in roles and play and so on. They're like, well, yeah, we're not into that. And so finding the right venue, and in this case it can be as explicit as a conference and the people that go to the conference. That's why I think this conference is so interesting, because it's explicitly trying to bring together people who care about art and who care deeply about art to to have the kinds of conversations that might push large in interesting directions. Finding that in the academic sense can be tricky, because those conferences exist, those journals do exist, but it's understanding what community it is that you're hoping to join that is the hardest thing I'll find, because they come from, well, I'm an anthropologist, and this is how anthropologists do research, and when I send my paper to a role-playing journal, who's going to read it? Are they going to understand that I'm coming from anthropology, from those tools, those methods, that framing, or not, and how do we manage that? I think that might be the biggest challenge at this point.
I think I want to be more specific about the notion about race and culture, in that it's a problem with engaging with the different definitions of diversity and intersectionality in a lot of communities, and really the breadth of research for education psychology and really psychology at all broadly has been historically focused on weird research, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic research. So the space for research on people like me and other marginalized folks while growing is still very, very not accessible or just hard to find in so many different ways.
What do you think has been sort of the greatest boost or help? I mean, was it a mentor or, stumbling upon something most?
Naivete was mine. I was lucky. So I did my undergraduate and master's in Chile at the Catholic University of Chile. So totally disconnected from the rest of the world. Chile was like really far away. If you don't know, it's the long kid country on the west side of South America. And so there was a professor he started up a research project making educational games for first graders. And I took a class with him, and from this class, he literally recruited a bunch of us young engineers to work basically programming and developing games for the project. And that sort of made me realize that, I guess games could be a thing that I could do as research. I've always had an interest in research. My family is sort of quite academic in that sense, so it wasn't never this crazy thing that I had never encountered before. But basically, I just told him, hey, I want to do my master's thesis on games, and he was like, okay. And as long as I was able to convince him that I was doing rigorous work, and by rigorous work that basically meant that I had a lot of references and citations, it seemed credible, because he didn't know anything about games, then I was just good to go. And so it was mostly, my approach was mostly, I think that's the right journal to send it to, and I send it and it get rejected. But the editors were kind and nice, and they said, well, you're not really a fit, but try these other three. And so I sent another, and then eventually it was sort of get in. So I think persistence was sort of key. It's a persistence and not being afraid to do it, and not being afraid of realizing that whatever it is that you did was maybe wrong for some reason. So sort of being humble and naive, I think that combination can help me out.
In just the field of academia and the kind of people that you tend to need to be in academia in general, lends itself to, say, natural overthinking and rumination, and the understanding and the continued visualization of the meta of where we are and how things go both politically and socially. Like a lot of what drove me to go, I don't want to work on this thing that I was working on for my PhD. I actually want to work on something that I fucking love. And then went into games, and then met somebody like Dr. Bowman, so it gave me access to a lot of great people and opened up the world of research for me as a native scholar to be more international and less worried about and having to continue to go back to where the research has in games has been for the last decade or so, which has been video games. And a lot of the things that I like to do or work and read around tend to have me tracing back to James G. and Nick Yee and Mark. That now that there is a set scholarship and people here who are producing work so that my stuff that I'm constantly thinking about can tie back into without having to go and refer back to MMOs, because that's what a lot of other people are really thinking about playthrough. That's really where I'm sitting at, and where the general question was.
The things that have helped you the most.
That if it hadn't been for Sarah, if it hadn't been for my advisor, Dr. Amende, who had given me the room to think about LARP and play as an indigenous methodology and to think about connections to land and culture and genesis in creation of games and characters in that way, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, and I wouldn't be looking at LARP the way I am. Also, I probably would still be LARPing on a more consistent basis because I would be ignoring a lot of what I consider to be problematic styles of play and continued dominant single stories that persist and prevent people like me from enjoying a lot of the LARPs that I used to enjoy and no longer feel content to just ignore all the crappy things that are going on, not just with communities, but just the way that people play games and the settler colonial stories that continue to persist, a la murder hobos and the like. I'm no longer content to be the gamer that I was 10 years ago.
So I think for me, this idea of community has been really important, and finding people that I can talk to about games in the way that I want to talk to them about games, people that we have a conversation and then are like, oh hey, we should co-author a piece together, or that are like, hey, I'm going to send you this thing that I wrote, can you give me some feedback? Having those kinds of relationships when it comes to doing research, when it comes to doing scholarship, are so important, I think, to get you to feel like you're seriously a scholar, but also to for me, have been really enriching. They've provided me with opportunities to further my research and scholarship. They've provided me with opportunities to really engage with the literature that exists. It's a way to sort of open those opportunities, and those communities and networks support you when you're feeling frustrated, and help you get ideas and expand your thinking. So I think, finding those other people that think about games the way that you do, maybe that share sort of similar research focus, or whatever it is that allows you to talk to each other. That for me, I think, has been the biggest thing.
Gaming or in gaming research, what is the most cutting edge thing that you're finding interesting right now? What is grabbing your attention that's going on right now? I know, Gabe, you mentioned having some issues with the gaming world, and legitimately, definitely. So what are you excited about that's out there that you're looking forward to?
Are we just sticking to just LARP research?
No. Any kind of gaming or LARP research that you're interested in.
Accessibility. I got another friend of mine in the engineering department back at UW, John Porter, who's working accessibility and design. It's fucking phenomenal, and he's working with Microsoft on a new form of accessibility controller with different placement, bigger buttons, and all sorts of just really awesome, just in general thing that they're looking toward the Xbox accessibility controller, or the ZAC, as he's excited to call it, so we can label his Zach Morris. I love that. The notion of accessibility and design has improved so much, and I'm excited for it to hit augmented reality and virtual reality in more impressive ways that don't nick at ableism so much, especially in terms of visualization. The NVIDIA being able to use natively have color blindness controls just in the card, so that no matter what app you're looking through, it lets you do whatever in terms of color blindness. Those kinds of things are really cool to me. But in terms of stuff that's further on the horizon, more people of color designing games, and stories like Upper One Alaska's game Never Alone. A lot of the indie-focused design games that Dragon Cancer, Papers, Please, while now a few years dated, are still being heavily talked about in ways that say, oh damn, there should be more stories like that. There's thought to that I just want to like, you know what, I'm just going to dump everything that I'm doing to the side because I'm just going to go design games for the rest of my life. But then I'm like, maybe that's not going to be the best way that I should raise my child. So like just the notion of being able to tell our stories in a meaningful way culturally and with the genesis of where we are from, and not just have our sense of self erased, not just in avatars, but really just the way that stories could be told is more and more impressive to me these days than anything.
Do you have? Okay, so one of the things that I'm really interested in is research that like defringifies LARP, and that makes comparisons between LARP and other hobbies that people have. So I'm really excited about research that has started to make bridges between leisure studies and LARP studies, and ideas about like how is LARP similar to like being part of a quilting circle, or how is it similar to like going scuba diving, and like are there these larger structural factors, are these systematic factors that we can look at within people's sort of hobbies and how they spend their time and how they spend their money, and I'm a sociologist, so I'm also really interested in sort of groups and relationships and interpersonal conflicts and community building, and sort of how that plays out in LARP communities, in play communities, and again looking at the similarities. Are there things that are distinctive about LARP because of what it is, in terms of play and games and taking on characters? But then are there things that are similar, right? That we can extrapolate. These are things that happen when humans get together and do things in groups. That research really is exciting for me.
I'd like to highlight two big things. Last couple of years, we've seen a lot of LARPs that start to incorporate digital and computational technologies in their play, and I think that trend will continue. And I'm excited to see a sort of the LARPification of the rest of the world in many ways, which is thanks in part to like advanced projection technologies and Wi-Fi, sort of wireless technologies. So going to a Disney park is now much more like a LARP in many ways, in some aspects. And so I think we're at a point where we're going to start to see some really new, interesting, and different kinds of games that are being supported and augmented in many ways by technologies to do things that I can't think of right now because we don't even have those yet. But 5 years time, the blockbuster LARP might be a totally different kind of experience. It might be worldwide. It might be embedded in different experiences and so on. So I think that's kind of exciting, is to see how, as technologies become cheaper, easier to use, and more accessible, how they're going to be incorporated and used in these new kinds of experiences. The second thing I'm really excited about is there's a lot of people working on really trying to understand what is engaging, what drives engagement and interest for different people in games and sort of interactive experiences. And I think as we gain a better and deeper understanding of what motivates people to play, what keeps them engaged, how they disengage, and so on, across sort of lots of different factors and variables, we will also get better at designing experiences that work better for more people more of the time, which is both scary and exciting. The scary part is thinking about, is this going to be like the Matrix, which is we're disembodied, but in some fantasy world all the time? Or is it going to be sort of like WALL-E, which is like, I'm in my LARP chair and I'm just in my mind doing all this stuff? Or exciting in the sense that now we can really make sure that everyone is having a really great experience or getting what they want out of an experience sort of all the time, because let's say. We have sophisticated AI, DM technology that's running in the background doing cool stuff. That can sense when someone is about to get, frustrated or worried about something. You could change the game and defuse the game along the way. So I think we're close to being at that point, which is super cool.
All right, so I have one more question, and I'm going to open the floor to general questions. So what games are you playing and loving right now?
Loving?
Maybe just enjoying?
So the Destiny 2 expansion just dropped, and I'm missing not being able to get into it right now, but I play a lot of Destiny 2 as a social experience, mostly actually, with people from Chile and other South American countries. We get online, we play, we have fun.
That's it.
That sucks the most hours of my gameplay time.
When the D2 Warmind expansion dropped, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna find the time to. No. but I've certainly sunk my fair share of hours in it, and while I can't say, oh, I've enjoyed every part of it, I'm still playing it because I really do enjoy the fast-paced design, if not the EA microtransactions that go into it.
I feel bad because I don't play a lot of new games. So yeah, I've been teaching game design, and I've been running this after-school program for high school students. So a lot of what I've been doing is like going back into the catalog, and like sort of bringing the things that I think are interesting and useful, and do like interesting, innovative, and most of my game playing is analog. I watch people play video games, but I don't really play them myself, which all of my game design students are like, Dr. Jones, why don't you play video games? Is it just because you're really bad at them? And I'm like, yeah, actually. Pretty much. So for me, Betrayal at House on the Hill is a really great one. I feel like I've played it with like all of these different audiences, and it's always really interesting to like watch different player groups engage with the game. Tokaido is another, and it's a really great game to like think about what is and is not a game. A lot of my game design students wrote in their reflection papers that it wasn't a game, so it was a great game for discussion, and it's gorgeous. I definitely am a sucker for board games that have really beautiful cards and art and stuff like that. Small Worlds is a good time. Trying to think of what else I've played recently. Yeah, but I think those are three that are worth, if you haven't already checked them out, they're worth checking out because they do interesting things.
If you're into board games, I'd also recommend Captain Sonar. It's an incredibly tense, engaging experience that you can LARPify as much as you want, and it sort of lends itself to that. It's basically a sort of Hunt for Red October, up to 8 players, so 4 and 4, 2 teams trying to find another sub. And it has a lot of voice, like, I don't want to call them commands, but basically a lot of instructions or a lot of information is vocal. And so you get to be the captain and someone else is the navigator and the engineer, and you're like, hush, hush, like talking about as you're trying to find the other sub and vice versa. So definitely check that one out. I think it's very good.
Sub simulator?
It's better than that. It's sort of like Battleship on steroids plus LARP.
Oh yeah, that sounds nice.
Captain Sonar.
Captain Sonar.
It's the only game I know that comes with 2 big ass like DM screens, basically to separate. You have these little sheets and you're like marking stuff with like markers.
Oh.
It's super exciting.
Speaking of DM screens, Mysterium is another one that is has been a go-to game.
Open the floor now. Anybody has any questions?
What's something that you want to see happen within LARP academia within 5 years?
Everything is pretty slow.
Yeah.
Maybe 7. I'll give you 2 more.
A center. you know, while the development of game study centers has been slow, and that's actually one of my go-tos for a 5-10 year project, is making sure that for me the Pacific Northwest has a game study center, because we've got Microsoft and Nintendo and yada yada, Valve and yada yada yada, and everybody's developing games without studying anything. I would love to see some more things like that for LARP research centered somewhere.
I'd like to see just the word LARP being used more in other academic contexts as well, as a sort of sign of, yes, it is sort of bleeding in. So in academia, we're really good at sort of coming up with new terms that use more words to explain stuff for which we have other words. So I'm in interactive entertainment, it's like I'm in games, right? And so we see a lot of this where like a lot of people will describe something that they built and they're testing and so on, but they'll call it like it's a fictionalized narrative experience simulation. You know, like, that's a LARP, just call it a LARP. I like to see that, more people just calling stuff LARP, and that the word becoming more commonly used to refer to like the broad spectrum of LARP-like things.
As a level designer calling it progressive theater in the woods.
Yeah.
I would like to see more LARP research that draws on like social science research techniques. So I should have said this earlier, but I'm going to say it now. One other thing I would suggest, if you're interested in doing LARP research and you're interested in particularly like ethnographic or interview methods, is like go and read some studies that aren't on LARP. Because that's, I think, for me, as a social scientist, is being able to have research that is really well constructed, I think would be a really useful thing for the field and would help us to really sort of push findings and arguments and concepts further, because we'd have that like rich data to draw from.
You know, a lot of our terms are drawn out of multiple fields anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Immersion, I mean, people can go and look at play therapy as a part of the kinds of works that we can be talking about. Interdisciplinarity is already built into us.
And I mean, even something that doesn't even have to have anything to do with play, right? Mm-hmm. Just read some ethnographies, just read some good, interview, studies, and see, what they did and how they did it, and how could you replicate that in terms of studying LARP or games, I think would be great.
So I have a question on why you think people aren't using LARP. So I'm in anthropology, and I've been talking academically about LARP at like our main conferences and stuff. And one of the ways that I explain LARP is some like mix in between historical reenactments and Renaissance fairs as two things that like might hook people like, oh, I know what that is, like envision what this is. And I said historical reenactment and LARP in the same sentence, and literally had a historical reenactor come up and be like, you cannot do that in this discipline. And I was like, what? Because there's like the stigma against LARP from other things that I would definitely consider LARP. In America, that's the case. I've seen other things like Scandinavia that are, like they kind of see all of it as LARP. It's very different. So how do we get people to stop doing that? That's my question.
That's a good question. This is like, how do terms become adopted, right?
Right.
I think part of it was just by normalizing them. So yeah, someone jumped up and said, hey, don't use those two things together. And you go, oh, thank you very much. And then just keep on using them together.
That's what I've been doing. But.
And you get to a point where you realize that at some point you can drop label. Because I guess it's being aware of when people are confused or don't know what you're talking about, what things are you adding, and then also being aware of what things you don't need to say anymore because they're starting to get it.
Yeah.
We're always trying to find, I think we're at a point now where we don't need to explain role-playing anymore, for example. And that's just a matter of time has passed. And that's a generational thing too, right? With popular culture really going mainstream with comic books and role-playing and so on, you get to a point where like, oh, it's like D&D, okay, and people kind of understand or have some notion of what that might mean. And so I think I encourage people to try out and test new metaphors or new associations. So maybe we don't really see a historical reenactment, and we just may say, it's like D&D, but you're not around the table. And like, oh, maybe people will get that. Or it's like an escape room, but in an open space. Like, oh, okay, I get it. Or an escape room with no puzzles. Maybe there's like we can come up with new metaphors. And we test them, we see they don't work, we'll drop them. If we test them, we see they work, we continue to use them until we realize that we don't need to use them anymore. So I think it just takes time and conscious awareness of the words we're choosing to use, the examples, and when they're landing or not. In the context of academic work, just cite a lot of people that use those words and that use LARP and so on, and then that becomes a part of the corpus that is commonly referenced and used.
Personally, I don't think that it should be forced, because there's a difference between, my second degree was in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And so the importance of prescriptive versus descriptive grammaring and vocabulary is really, really a deep-seated place for me. And so just being able to define it in your own work, no matter what, means that, following the citation trail is what everybody as an academic needs to do anyway. So whoever and however you want to be doing it is making sure that your foundation and what your philosophy and framework that you're continuing to work through is always within the grasp of your papers, or easily put into your poster presentations, or however you want to talk about it. Just eventually you get down to the shorthand of whatever you want to be doing, because you've said the same paragraph, 30 different papers. So the making it people who will follow you, not just follow a field, would be particularly important.
But I think too, what I'm hearing from your comments and question is also about stigma, right? So it's not just about what terminology do we use, but the fact that if you're studying LARP, you're studying something that is stigmatized. And I think the stigma is different in different communities, right? Like historical reenactors, they get really, really touchy when you call it LARP. Okay, we can, unpack that as as social scientists and why that might be. But I think, again, finding those moments and maybe in that moment unpacking it with the historical reenactor was not the right decision, but sometimes it might be, right? Sometimes it might be worth, let's have a discussion about why you think LARP is something that you don't want to be associated with, right? And I think the more that we can write scholarly articles about LARP that take LARP seriously as an art form, or as a form of engagement, or as an interactive experience, that will just help to destigmatize it, right? The more that we can talk about it in a way that is not stigmatized, and if you're in a place where you can challenge that stigma, or unpack the stigma, or question that stigma, I think part of it, again, is that a lot of people do have this very limited idea of what LARP is, or if you know LARP only from these movies or television shows, you might have a very limited idea of what LARP can be. And so some of us, our scholarship may be helping to destigmatize by saying, you think LARP is this, but actually it's this. Or you think LARP is silly because it's people putting on elf ears and running around in the woods, but I'm going to show you how it's actually a really powerful experience for people, and how we shouldn't just write it off as something silly that people do, but that it actually is worth studying and is worth thinking and talking about.
Difficulty of getting funding and recognition and support for doing research, and the idea of doing long-term ethnography sounds amazing. So do you have any ideas or know of any alternative forms of funding, or any strategy that we can, as an academic community, think of to
Wait, I have an answer to that.
problem? Great.
Yeah. I was just reading a book where the ethnographer who was studying like old school Renaissance games kickstarted their study to get funding for travel and things like that. And so that seems Maybe that's the first answer that's going to leap off of everyone's lips as a perspective, but here's a scholar who actually did that, and so that's something to consider.
Patreon is also a really good spot for things, if you, considering the kind of networks that you already have, and the forms of media that you can put tidbits of your research out into. There's a greater push for open access in a lot of ways. So having the Patreon tip jar and being able to give talks and consultations in that matter, always real strong. And really, like, because of the nature of interdisciplinarity, community organizational research, technology research, and all sorts of other avenues that are already being funded through the NSF and other ways that you can tweak a lot of your designs to go into.
I think one trick is to find collaborators. So you're never going to get the $5 million NSF grant unless you're working with someone who really knows how to get $5 million NSF grants. And so finding the partners that can speak the language of the agencies or communities where there is a lot of money can be really valuable. And that's assuming you're not willing to sort of sell out too much, right? And going for funding always implies some amount of selling out, right? You're going to have to spin your pitch so that it makes sense to whoever it is that is going to give you the money, and that's not selling out, that's just being honest, right? They're saying, hey, I'm going to give you this money if you do this thing I care about, and you're saying, well, I want to do the thing I care about, and other things you care about, so we need to find this common ground where we can both do the thing that we both care about and everyone's happy. So I think that's part of the trick, is learning that language and finding a way to explain what you want to do in the terms of what the other person wants to fund, such that they can see its value and be able to understand what contribution it might be making to themselves, right? So this goes to the sort of the, should you use LARP or not use LARP? Well, sometimes you have to use the words to it's all about communication. So if the other person on the other side is not going to understand what you're trying to do, then that's on you. So maybe you're using the wrong words because they don't know them. Right? So you need to use their words and then also slip in yours so that they can start to make those associations. That's also part of the trick.
I mean, just outside of governmental funding, we have tons and tons of nonprofits to reach back on, whether or not you're talking about Chan Zuckerberg or the Gates Millennium Foundation. But even besides that, since LARP is a community-based form of play, you can talk to United Way, you can talk to the YMCA, you can talk to the Scouts of America, you can talk to the Girl Scouts and get them to be involved and invested so that you are transforming their organization as much as they're helping fund your work.
Hi, I'm Krista. Just hearing different games that people were talking about yesterday at the EduLARP conference and in the hallways here. There are so many, I think that one key to getting into academic funding on it is actually the power of how LARPs can be applied. And then using that language. So if there are NSF grants that have included what they call public deliberation exercises or public deliberation of scenarios. And quite often those are using basically LARP frameworks, not necessarily, dramatic, costume, beautiful LARPs, but the understanding a scenario and inserting yourself in it and perspective taking and active listening. Or so many of these games involve perspective taking and active listening, which are of course, like in the last 2 years, something that people are very interested in, and we are realizing in all sorts of educational settings and public settings how much we need to build those as skills in people. So it seems like figuring out what frames, you may not be able to do it on its own terms as LARP, but it certainly is something that you can make arguments about broader impacts to the National Science Foundation.
Oh, for sure.
If you're partnering up with nanotechnology scientists or community organizing. I mean, there's so much potential applications for it.
It's all of it is about finding the partner. So earlier today we were hearing about Event Horizon, right? It's like, oh, we have some researchers who are helping us out. I'm sure on the research side, they're not thinking, "Man, we need to do this web thing." They were thinking, hey, we have these wearable technologies and we need to find like an application space where we can test some of our ideas. And it just so happened for them that this Event Horizon thing was like, this sounds like a good fit. You know, it would be a drive-on, people using this stuff at the weekend, there would be interactions and so on. And so sort of finding partners where you can say, hey, here's what we could do, whatever it is that you're doing, and sort of leverify it or use it in this context. I think could be a valuable source that people might not otherwise think about. Because you have to feel like you're alone, like, oh, I need to do this whole thing by myself. Sometimes there's someone else who just needs like an excuse to test something out in a way that is hopefully sexy, cool, or get like newspaper headlines and stuff like that. And we at the Utah, we work a lot with medicine, and they don't understand what we do, but they understand that it's cool, that it's sexy, and there's money in it. And so everybody's happy. They get to show us some cool apps that we made, and we get to say, hey, we paid 10 students for 2 semesters to work on this thing.
All right, we are actually out of time, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and I'm sure that our panelists would be happy to answer questions afterwards if you want us to.